can understand why a lot of scientists like nuclear power. The idea of man producing vast amounts of electricity from a controlled and continuous nuclear explosion is very appealing. Politicians also like mega projects that sound like solutions to big problems. And they, in my experience, especially like big dams and giant nuclear power stations. But there are those with less faith in science who worry about accidents. And some names come to mind, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, or in 1957 Windscale in Cumbria, later renamed Sellafield. Some others worry not about safety, but about ethics, particularly about the waste. The fact that 50 years have passed and no solution has been found. But as we've already heard, some environmentalists are prepared to put these and other considerations aside because of the greater threat of climate change. But in my view, nuclear is not the answer, and worse, a dangerous diversion from much quicker solutions. But first, let me take one step back and remind you that as far as renewables are concerned, this is an energy-rich island, and yet the most undeveloped country for renewables in Europe. Add together the UK's potential for wind, wave, marine, solar, biomass, small-scale hydro, landfill gas, hot rocks and various rubbish digesters, and you get more than 100% of the UK's current electricity demand. The government has currently swallowed the industry's deception that nuclear power will be cheaper than renewables. This stupidity will cost all of us a great deal of money. Nuclear power has a long history of being an expensive technology that fails to live up to its promises. In 2005, nuclear new build began again in Europe with the Finnish evolutionary pressurized water reactor. At 1,600 megawatts, the largest reactor ever to be built. It is the prototype of the sort expected to be built in Britain. It was budgeted at €3 billion and costs are still rising. It is now expected to cost at least €5.3 billion. Our government seems to be ignoring this unfortunate reality, but it does not fill me with confidence that nuclear power is the answer or that it can ever deliver. Meanwhile, our untapped renewable resources remain untapped. I think it is both a tragedy and a waste.
It's generally stated that we need three things from our energy supplies. We need secure energy supplies, and that's particularly complicated with electricity because we can't store the stuff. And that means we've got to have enough capacity actually generating electricity at the time of peak demand, which is usually about 5:30 on January the 25th. The lowest demand at 4 o'clock in the morning in late July is typically about a third of the peak demand. So there's a very interesting issue there. Firstly, what happens on those cold winter nights? They're cold because there's no wind, so we're in an anticyclone. We had the great anticyclones of 3 or 4 years ago, which sat over the whole of Northern Europe at the same time, which basically means 0% wind speed, no wave power because the wave depends on the wind to a considerable extent, and the coldest nights of the year. So you can entirely write off your wind power and wave power, not that anybody's got any wave power capacity as yet. Electricity and energy has to be as economic as possible. That's been a dramatically changing picture from 1998 when the oil price was below $10 a barrel to around a year ago when it had touched $147 a barrel. And also it needs to be environmentally acceptable. One of the most remarkable things is that we can have a session now saying the nuclear revival or something with a question mark over it, because 5 years ago there was no question mark, there was no nuclear revival. The 2003 Energy White Paper in this country said very clearly no nuclear. But just 5 years later, the 2008 Nuclear White Paper was talking about very major investment. And the reasons for that are that the 1990s looked extraordinarily comfortable in all of those three areas. We had the dash for gas, politically inspired to destroy the coal industry. We had massive overcapacity in the system by the year 2000 when privatisation of electricity supply was complete. We had a brand new technology, the combined cycle gas turbine, very, very efficient technology. So in terms of security, and of course we had our own North Sea gas supplies, so we've got secure supplies through the dash for gas. They're economically attractive. CCGT is economically very efficient, certainly at the low gas price that was pertaining at the time. And because we were shifting from coal to gas, which only releases about half as much carbon dioxide per unit of electricity generated, and also has much lower implications in terms of acid rain and other pollutants such as fly ash, then our environmental position was looking quite good. People swanned around the world in both the Major and Blair governments saying how brilliant the United Kingdom was in environmental terms, when we'd simply got a completely accidental windfall from what was an economic policy because it happened to switch from a highly intensive carbon fuel to a less intensive one. That looks really very different now. In terms of security of supply, we've seen large-scale failure of major renewable schemes across Europe in maintaining security of supply, most notably in the summer of 2003, when, again, we had that big heat wave in Europe, which again was caused by an anticyclone. Average output from Europe's wind farm was 1.5% during that period of time. Massive electricity cuts. Italy blacked out entirely for 24 hours. Mr. Putin's shenanigans over Russian gas have been very obvious. Our own North Sea gas has pretty much gone, or certainly will have within 5 years. We're a net gas importer now. Indeed, we're a net energy importer, in effect, for the first time since the invention of the steam engine, apart from a short period in the 1960s. So security of supply looks dodgy. Economics, certainly at the much higher prices at the moment of fossil fuels, look dodgy, although certainly the economics of nuclear are complex, and the industry certainly must demonstrate that it's not going to run into the cost overruns that we did before. But having said that, I simply don't understand why the same people who are saying that renewables are cheaper are also arguing that renewables need this enormous market subsidy, which emerges through the renewables obligation and the huge financial penalties if you don't meet it, whereas nuclear should not get those. I'd have thought if there was an honest belief in renewables being cheaper, there would be an argument that they should be treated the same way in the marketplace, and it's demonstrable that that's not the argument that one gets around these. But certainly the economics are complex, and I am very sceptical that nuclear can be built without some sort of active state involvement. It won't be subsidy, and the reason for that is that it will be defined in such a way that it's not a subsidy. The renewable thing isn't a subsidy because people have defined that subsidy as being an obligation. And in terms of the environment, well, this is one of the only two large-scale, very low-carbon sources, hydropower being the other, which are demonstrably available on a large scale. And if we take into account that we need to cut greenhouse gas emissions by something like 80 or 90% by the year 2050, and we've got to get moving fairly quickly, then it seems to me a bizarre suggestion that when we have two sources of energy, large-scale hydro and nuclear, the only two sources of energy that Paul criticised, but the idea that we should be backing out of one of the only two large-scale proven technologies that can contribute in all three of our challenges on the hope that something might come up seems to me to be the very definition of irresponsibility.
We're rather in danger of thinking that just having more energy is going to somehow allow us to interact with systems in a more sustainable way, that we can always solve the problems, that we can change issues that are essentially ecological issues, dealing with how ecosystems work, ecosystems as complex, adaptive systems with large-scale material flows in them, that we are somehow in a position with more energy to simply control these systems. We discovered more and more recently that these systems, these ecosystems, for example, they're complex adaptive systems. They have different sorts of behaviours, from normal artefacts we might deal with, the normal energetic systems. When we need to understand and manage these systems, we need to understand and control our interaction. We need a fundamentally different approach to engineering these systems. But at the same time, we're saying we want innovation, but innovation is purely defined as replacing our interaction with ecosystems, replacing the complex activity of ecosystems, complex biological processes, such as the soil-nitrogen cycle, with more simple mechanical or chemical interventions in these systems. But this to me seems fundamentally wrong-headed. I would like to ask the question, where are the new sciences of ecology and biology in this perspective on innovation and this perspective on technology? Can we not use the capacity of these systems, their resilience, their robustness, their adaptability, and think about working with these systems in a more elegant fashion? To me, that is the more exciting end of technological innovation. And this might be small scale, it might be distributed, It might look low-tech, but because it comes from a position of more exciting science, greater knowledge of our interaction with the complex systems, the coupled complex systems of economy, ecology, and society with which we interact, it's actually more exciting science. We should be thinking of ourselves as conscious interactors in these systems, a niche constructing species, managers of these systems. We have a long way to go with that. We know that these systems can have nonlinear behaviours, that they can respond in unpredictable ways to the interventions that we make in them. I do think we need nuclear power to transition to this new technology. We have a lot of work to do in understanding how these systems work and how we can interact with them. And I would subscribe to the point of view put forward by people like James Lovelock that we simply have a larger risk apparent from climate change than we do with nuclear power.
I think nuclear energy potentially has a very great future. Nuclear is clearly the leading prospects on the table. What is behind the nervousness and opposition? And I think it perhaps helps to go back a bit historically and try and understand how this has come about, to put in perspective what's happening today. The emergence of nuclear energy and nuclear power into public consciousness with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, perhaps not surprising that from the beginning there has been certain unease there. I think you can see through the 50s and 60s real tension between, on the one hand, what nuclear is showing the capacity of human beings to unleash and control very large natural forces, and at the same time the power of humanity to use those things destructively. And I think you can see, as you move from that origins of nuclear energy and the first opposition to it to the more recent period in the 70s, 80s through to the present, there are a couple of fairly significant and related shifts that go on in attitudes towards nuclear. First, there's a shift from an emphasis on the problem being deliberate misuse of a technology to the idea that the essence of the problem is accidental disasters and catastrophes. The second related shift amongst the critics of nuclear energy is one which says, rather than the problem being particular misuse of a technology to a particular end, rather the problem is the technology which seems to take on a life of its own as determining the path down which we move. And, I think you can see this in the contrast between, for example, in the 50s, if you look at kind of left-wing peace campaigners, were often the same people who were very enthusiastic about the prospects for civil nuclear energy and civil nuclear power and, very enthusiastic about technology. And I think that what's behind both those shifts is really the sense that human beings are just not up to handling these technologies one way or another. We don't understand them well enough. We don't understand the risks. We're not in control of them. They're too big, too difficult to deal with. People are uncomfortable with intervention in nature. If we can cover some confidence in the capacity of society to deal with these things, if we can generate the economic resources and growth that we need to invest in nuclear energy, as we're seeing in places like China and India, then maybe we can follow their example in building a new generation of nuclear, rather than what I hope doesn't happen is the opposite, is that we drag them down into our cultural malaise.
My colleague on my right perpetrated a myth about the heat wave in 2005, I think it was, or 2003. One of the reasons that the electricity was turned off was because a lot of the nuclear power stations in France had to be turned down because their cooling water comes from rivers, and the rivers were running dry and too hot. And to prevent ecological damage, they had to be turned down. So the power cuts in Italy were not through lack of wind, because there was virtually no wind power available, but because there was no nuclear power available. And Italy imports a great deal of power from nuclear stations which weren't working. And I would say one other thing about the collapse of civilization. I went to Copenhagen talks in March where the scientists were telling the policymakers for this upcoming conference. And they were saying that by 2050 we're supposed to have 9 billion population with a lot of energy demand. But by 2100 they expect the population of the planet to have collapsed to 2 billion or 1 billion because many people will have starved to death and many parts of the world will not be able to feed themselves. So I think we're talking about a period where we'll be running power stations when civilization is no longer capable of operating them.
There is an enormous confusion in the minds of governments like ours as to whether electricity is a commodity or a social service. If it's a commodity, then you'll provide it by a free market. You'll take off all the brakes except for unfair competition, and you'll put a price on externalities like carbon. But you'll then say to the market, go off and decide. You'd remove all special treatment for the renewables that this market is riven with at the moment. You'd simply say, the object is this amount of carbon coming out, you go and find the most economically attractive way of doing it. If energy is a social service, you'll run it much more centrally. You will ensure security of supply by diktat, because you can't ensure security of supply in a pure market system, in which case you would get much lower demand. You get state demands on rates of return, you get government picking winners. Government would guide, would dictate the mix of fuel. The problem we've got at the moment is that we have a confusion at the philosophical heart of this, so we have a confusion in policy. We have supposedly a market, but we have ridiculous subsidies for renewables just because someone has decided that it would be a politically nice thing to do. There's no technical or environmental case for subsidising renewables in that sense, in my view. You would tax carbon very heavily to get to where you're going, and then you would abandon, you would leave things to the market if you're doing it that way. But what we have at the moment, the government keeps intervening on pretty much an 18-month basis to change the fundamental rules of the market. Nobody's going to invest long term. They're just going to invest in short-term sources, in other words, combined cycle gas turbine, and they're not going to get that innovation which is necessary to push these technologies forward. So at some point, government's going to have to decide, is it going to follow a much more pure market approach or a much purer command and control approach?
I think there's this real, on both sides of the debate, there's a false idea that somehow here's nature and here we are. As long as we have that perspective, whether we're saying that we should have no impact on nature or somehow replace nature, then we're just not dealing with the reality with our interaction with these systems. You know, there's no such thing as natural or unnatural. That's a completely false debate. But a large majority of people are not informed citizens when they're coming into this debate from either side, I would say, either from the importance of the biology or the sort of supposed unnaturalness of nuclear power.
Fundamentally, the outlook today is that the better solution is to cut back in energy demand rather than trying to meet that by expanding supply. And, you know, I think that's why the kind of rise of climate change is very unlikely to lead to a revival of a new nuclear age, because the whole way in which the climate discussion has been framed is, well, look, people have been doing too much messing up the planet, and the solution, the way out, is going to be to do less. You know, until we start, you know, making that case for doing more, then I don't think that, you know, climate is going to drive any kind of real practical solutions.
So I like your idea about humanity having this great innovation, and that there's a negativity about that innovation and our intelligence at the moment to embrace a resource and advance the cause of humanity. But the question is, have we got the necessary safeguards in place to renew the nuclear industry in terms of transportation, in terms of running stations, and in terms of disposal?
Now, when it comes to wind energy, it doesn't produce a regular source of energy, and it produces energy 30% of the day, but not when you want it, just when there's wind. So it doesn't solve the problem of, you know, producing energy when there are peaks of demand. So I'm not sure what you think wind energy is going to do in that picture and how it's going to help us.
I was down a bunker playing war games when Chernobyl went up, and that was poor design, poorly managed. Nobody uses it anymore. Nobody died at 3 Mile Island or Windscale. I've worked on nuclear subs. I've been to Hiroshima, but I don't glow in the dark. I've also been to 2 meetings of the Committee on Radioactive Waste Management. There's no problem with waste disposal. Thanks to the Americans and some previous politicians, we have some rather peculiar old nuclear power station with large graphite moderators. So the waste problem is one of bulk. One of my questions is going to be, are we able to use the thermal properties of hot waste, not radioactive thermal, for generating power? Renewables, we don't have the base load from them, which is one of the key problems. The main solution is halving the population. But I do recommend reading Sue Eon's report, the Royal Academy of Engineering, is basically on the new economics of nuclear power is the only way forward.
Intermittency of wind is one of the great chestnuts of this debate. All the other technologies I mentioned, particularly undersea turbines and so on, are not intermittent. We know the tide timetables for the next 100 years. Nuclear, on the other hand, has to be shut down for maintenance when it has an accident, or as when Sizewell closed down recently, unexpectedly, the lights went out in quite a large area of England.
Is it as safe as it can possibly be? Well, no. If you want to be safer, then don't build it. I mean, there will be some risk. Then, of course, you must realise that coal mining and emissions from coal power stations kill more people than nuclear energy does right now. Evidence so far shows that nuclear energy is extremely safe, and certainly safer than coal.
In terms of the intermittency of wind, I would just suggest that you look at the 2004 EonNet wind report, which looks at the wind output from the wind farm, almost 6,000 megawatts of wind generators in Germany in the area covered by the EonNet's distribution company. So absolutely fascinating graphs in those. The most dramatic in November 2003, showing that the output from this farm fell by 3,600 megawatts over a 6-hour period because the wind fell. It was 10 megawatts per minute over a 6-hour period. For that not to cause major cuts in Germany, someone had gas-fired stations ticking over, generating carbon dioxide, costing a lot of money, so they could be ratcheted back up. Denmark's different because hydro, the Norwegian hydro and the Danish wind make a good match. If you've got hydropower available, then wind's okay. But elsewhere, you have enormous cost and greenhouse gas implications of a significant wind industry, and it's unfortunate that those who advocate wind are not at least honest enough to address that particular point and tend just to say it's not important. One final point, though, and this is crucial. Nuclear electricity is fundamentally a baseload source of energy at the moment, and baseload covers something like 30% of our electricity use. Renewables can't be used for baseload for the very reasons that were picked up in one of the questions there. So nuclear energy is not competing with renewables at any point in the marketplace. For baseload, the choice is nuclear, gas, or coal.
Of course, it's important to have baseload and to have a sort of a responsive capacity in the grid, but we don't have to think about the grid staying the same either. I mean, simultaneously with these technologies, we have new ideas like smart grids, like smart meters in homes, which allow us to match our demand to supply.
I think we need to be very aware about the huge vested interest pressure being put on the government from the nuclear industry. And we say climate change isn't a driver, but I tell you, if you look at the nuclear industry's extremely huge pay packets to PR companies that are rebranding themselves as the driver for a low-carbon economy, it's definitely a factor. And we've got to be a bit more critical about those kind of vested interests and to question this idea that nuclear is not going to be competing with renewables. In terms of a cost and investment issue, it absolutely is. And there's a limited pot of money available. We've already looked at just quite how much money nuclear soaks up in its build in these new builds in Finland and France. And there is a competition here, and there is, to a degree, a choice to be made. And this idea that by questioning technology like nuclear, we're somehow irrational or anti-civilizational progress, it's grating to continue to hear that in this debate all through this energy strand. This is a question about which technology is most appropriate, who owns that technology, who has to pay for it, what are the dangers associated with it. And I, as someone who would label myself an environmentalist, I think that's a purely rational decision-making process to go through, which people like yourself label as some kind of irrational, anti-technological sentiment, which really does start to grate after a while.
There seems to be 3 species of green There's the techno-hedonists, who are the lady at the front there who likes nuclear power but wants half the population. There's the people who want more people, but more people doing more laborious work and less productivity. And there is the optimum population trust, which is fewer people and lower productivity. The question really is, where do you get back to the Adam Smith, Karl Marx materialist position of more people and much higher productivity, so that we don't all work ourselves to death?
Well, where is this enormous vested interest supporting the nuclear industry? Because I haven't seen it for 20 years. Paul's absolutely right. That died the day Margaret Thatcher and the Thatcher government pulled the suggested programme of 10 PWRs. Nuclear electricity was pulled from the privatisation. Nuclear electricity lost pretty much all its support in the Conservative Party overnight, and that was the party of government till 97. And the Labour government was elected in 1997 on anti-nuclear pocket. The government at the moment is not considering investing in nuclear energy. It's very clear in the statements in that white paper and subsequent statements that it is for private companies to decide whether to build nuclear stations or not. And similarly, on the issue with competition with renewables, you can't. This is where, unfortunately, there is quite a lot of scientific misunderstanding, that people don't understand the difference between energy and power. And without that fundamental idea, we're not looking at the average amount of energy you can get out of a power source over a long period of time. We're looking at the amount of energy you can get out of it at a particular moment against the electricity demand at that particular moment. And that's why discussions of the intermittent renewables, yes, we know when the tide's going to be out for the next several hundred years. We also know that for a certain portion of time that's going to be at 4 o'clock in the morning when there's too much power on the system already. Predictability doesn't mean you're not intermittent. And in those sectors of the market where you need the electricity, or the lights go out in the hospital, or you can't run your transport system, or you don't pump water into your houses, or you don't have the basic levels of heating that are required in the winter, then you cannot rely on renewables.
Just on the political lobbies, which is where I fundamentally disagree with you. Political lobbies, there's a huge trade union movement. It's the strongest trade union of all in the nuclear industry. Every single person who works in a nuclear station at the moment is in danger of losing their jobs as they close down. Okay, it may not be for another 5-10 years, but they want new nuclear stations built next to theirs so they've got a job for the future. Every big construction company that used to build, or still does, build motorways all over the place, they love pouring concrete. And the biggest concrete pourers in prospect are nuclear power stations. They need more concrete than almost anything else. So there's a massive industrial political lobby here for nuclear power. Although the government claims that they're ambivalent about whether you have nuclear power or not, they have an Office for Nuclear Development which is pushing it very hard. It's a quango which the government pays for, along with lots of other things. And I would just say one thing about nuclear waste, on which unfortunately I'm an expert. Sellafield is a great big pile of nuclear waste. Some of it's not classified as nuclear waste, like the 110 tons of plutonium up there, which we don't know what to do with. We've got 40,000 tons of spent uranium, which is not suitable for recycling because it's full of radionuclides. We've got vast quantities of high-level nuclear waste, which we're desperately trying to turn into vitrified blocks, which will then need to be stored for 50 years before we find somewhere to put it geologically in the UK. And so far, we have not solved that problem. So whatever people say there's a technical solution, there may be a technical solution, but we haven't found it yet.
Accusation put against me that, this view of decision-making as irrational it just doesn't correspond to reality. I would suggest that it's in the 70s, more or less, is the period where, in relation to nuclear, this became the kind of primary constraint on the expansion of nuclear. I mean, you can see Jimmy Carter made a decision to end reprocessing of nuclear fuel in the US. You look at the basis on which the decision was made, and it was made on the grounds of non-proliferation and trying to prevent the spread of nuclear technologies that could result in proliferation of weapons around the world. But what Carter decided was actually, even within the US, right, they would give up on reprocessing of nuclear fuel. And for me, this isn't kind of some green hippies or something, being irrational about this and preoccupied with risk. This is, the President of the United States making a decision that even within the US, we're not prepared to reprocess because, we don't even trust ourselves that we can keep control of this technology. We have to roll back from this.
I don't think we can go forward without a realistic consideration of the material and energetic cycles of ecosystems, which we are starting to understand now. We're starting to understand that those systems are complex, dynamical systems which behave in different ways to the sorts of systems we're used to engineering or dealing with.
The reason we haven't got a waste policy yet and disposal policy is we've not needed it yet. Nuclear waste isn't causing anybody any problems at the moment. It's stored on site. Nobody's disadvantaged by it. In due course, of course, we need to find a disposal site for it. But the quantities are so tiny of the intermediate and high-level radioactive waste. By the year 2030, with all the nuclear power we've ever used in the UK since its inception in the 40s, really, the research into the weapons in the 40s, the total bulk we'll have produced will be about equal to 3 weeks' worth of domestic rubbish at the rate we're producing it at the moment. But we're going to need twice as much energy by 2050 and probably 3 times as much by 2100 as on current projections, without what produces 7/8 of the energy today. Barking mad to be saying we know today that we can do without nuclear in the future, and I think that would be the most irresponsible conclusion possible.
When I started writing about nuclear power, I was in favour of it. It's taken 25 years of studying it and writing about it and talking to nuclear people to come to the conclusion that it's too expensive. I think we can cope with lots of the other problems, but we can't cope with the economics. It's just too expensive.